Okay.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I just first wanted to let you guys know that reminder that the webinar will be recorded and posted later. And so also please send any questions that you have throughout the presentation to the chat function on Zoom. And then afterwards, when we have a little Q&A part, we can bring those questions back up. So our speaker today is Patricia Nabuco Martuscelli. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. Her research interests are family migration, child migration, children involved in armed conflicts, and migration and asylum policies. She was a visiting scholar at university centers in Switzerland and North Carolina, and is part of 3 research groups relating to human rights, international relations, and displaced people. She also has publications in national and international journals, and her thesis won a UNHCR award for the best PhD dissertation MA thesis. She's currently involved in research projects relating to refugees and migration policy in Brazil, as well as the situation of children involved in the Colombian armed conflict. So we are so fortunate today to have Patricia come speak for us. So without further ado, welcome, Patricia.
Thank you. I really thank you, Insight Collaborative, for the invitation to share with you a little bit of my research, and all the attendees for being here, especially my friend Natalia from Brazil. So I'll be sharing some slides with you, so we can have a better view. I will start sharing my slides now. Okay. Can you see my slides? I hope so. So today we are going to talk about contextual considerations with forced displacement and COVID-19. So first I'm going to show you some data, some numbers, some context connected to asylum. Then I'm going to discuss how these situations of asylum, they are connected with the current pandemic of COVID-19. Then I'm going to talk a little bit of my research with refugees and how they are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic in Brazil, some main findings, how they are affected, some lessons that they externalize about solidarity and collective conscience, and implications for practitioners' work, and what can we do from here as researchers, practitioners, advocates for this cause of refugees and migrants. So the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, they just told us that last year we had 79.5 million people that were forcibly displaced from their places. 26 million are refugees, or people that were recognized as a refugee because they had a well-founded fear of persecution due to their race, nationality, political opinion, religion, or because they were members of a particular social group. 45.7 million were internally displaced people, or IDP, that are people that they are in need of protection, but they don't cross an international border. So they stay in the country, but their state cannot protect them. 5.2 million are asylum seekers, so they applied for asylum and they are waiting for a decision. And 3.6 million are Venezuelans. And the interesting thing about Venezuelans, some of them applied for asylum and some were recognized as refugees, and many of them, they got other types of regularization or protection that is not asylum properly. But according to UNHCR, they are a population in need of protection. So they are this new apart category that we have now in this report from UNHCR. So last year, 40% of these 70.5 million people, they were children. We had 2 million new asylum claims, but 85% of this refugee population is in developing countries, and 27% of them are in the less developed countries. That is, mainly poor countries with their own development and other issues. And 73% of the refugees, they are in neighboring countries. What that means, that especially if they are near the borders, they are at risk of recruitment, these refugees, they are left unprotected in refugee camps. So we have to keep these numbers in mind when we are talking how COVID-19 affects this refugee population. Most part of refugees that we have, they come from 10 countries. So Syria, 6.6 refugees. Then we have Venezuela as the second one. And some studies, they say that Venezuela will surpass the situation in Syria in number of displacement really soon. Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Iraq, and the Central African Republic as places that are mostly countries of origin of refugees last year and still today. And the 10 top countries that received more refugees first is Turkey with more than 3.6 million, then Colombia with 1.8 Venezuelans, Germany 1.1 million refugees, then the Pakistan, Uganda, the United States, Sudan, Iran, Lebanon, and Peru. So from these top 10 countries that received refugees, just 2 of them are developed countries or rich countries, so Germany and the United States. And we have to keep in mind that the United States has been severely affected by the COVID situation. Here we can see the map with the numbers. So we see that in Latin America, most of the circles are red, so Venezuelans being displaced that are affected, particularly countries in Latin America. Then we see most part of the refugee populations are in African and Asian countries. And then we also see the situation in Europe, especially with Germany. In this, we see the population of internally displaced people. So the country with more internally displaced people currently is Colombia, and then Syria, but also Yemen, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these situations, we have also people in need of protection, people that have a hard time to access their rights, and people that have a higher probability of being left behind in the responses to COVID-19. And then we have the countries with more asylum seekers. So last year, United States was the country with more asylum seekers, followed by Peru, then Germany and Turkey, and Brazil was the 60th countries with more asylum seekers. And Brazil was also the country with more asylum seekers in the 60th countries with more asylum seekers in the world in 2018 as well. So what we know about COVID-19 for now. Refugees that are in camps and detention centers that are mainly the situation of refugees in many African and Asian countries and detention centers in Europe, but also in the United States, they face hard conditions. And especially the refugees that already have some specific vulnerability. So women, girls, elderly populations, people with chronic diseases. So they were already in situations where they cannot adopt measures of social distance recommended by the World Health Organization. Some refugee camps, they already lacked hygiene measures or healthcare for all the refugees. And when you have the COVID-19 hitting those camps and detention centers, many organizations that were providing services to the refugees in these camps, they had to withdraw their people. And those refugees, they are also in this situation. So refugees are especially vulnerable to COVID-19 and other diseases. They are left out from many of the responses. They have less access to healthcare, and they face higher economic precarity, since many refugees and asylum seekers cannot work in the asylum countries where they are at the moment. Also, refugees and migrants, they tend to be stigmatized and suffer from xenophobia, racism, and discrimination. And some politicians, they use refugees to blame for spreading the virus and other diseases, which is not, it was not proven true by scientific measures. We also saw the closure of borders and mobility restriction, and many resettlement programs were stopped or suspended, which put the life of refugees at risk. At the same time, we have seen situations of how migrants and refugees are contributing to countries. So in Europe, refugees that were nurses and doctors. They were invited to help to fight COVID-19, and also the role of local and refugee-led organizations in providing information and developing innovative measures to help the refugee population to face the COVID-19. But how about refugees that do not live in refugee camps or detention centers, but live in global south countries in big cities like the situation we have in Brazil? So I interviewed 29 refugees that live in Brazil by phone between the March 27th this year and April 6th. So this was the first phase of lockdown in Brazil. Those refugees, they were living in São Paulo and Rio states, mostly in big cities in those states. They were from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Venezuela, Mali, Cameroon, Guinea, and Guyana. And São Paulo and Rio, they adopted lockdown measures. So most of those refugees, they were at home because only the essential services were open. And some of those refugees, they were working those essential services like supermarkets, so they would go work, but most refugees, they were just staying at home. So again, Brazil has the highest number of Venezuelans refugees. So Brazil recognized last year 39,000 Venezuelans as refugees. So although Brazil is not the country with more Venezuelans, is the country that has recognized more Venezuelans as refugees. So for example, in Colombia, Venezuelans are not recognized as refugees. In Spain, there was another country where many Venezuelans applied for asylum. They are not recognized. They receive other types of protection, but Brazil decided to grant Venezuelans asylum based on the clause of grievous, serious, and generalized violation of human rights in Venezuela. So most refugees in Brazil and among my interviews, they are male and they are young. They are between 25, 35 years, and they live in big cities, so São Paulo and Rio. What are the main findings of my research? Because I wanted to understand how those refugees themselves, they were experiencing the pandemic and the measures that the government, the Brazilian government, the federal government, the state level government, and the local government were adopting to respond to the COVID-19 situation in Brazil. So those refugees, they are more affected by the measures to control the pandemic than Brazilians. And this is connected with their situation of mobility. I'm going to explain this a little bit more further. There were a lot of expressions of solidarity and social conscience, even from refugees that were in a very vulnerable situation. So unemployed refugees or refugees who had chronic diseases and were more at risk of COVID-19. Information was a main issue for the refugees because there were a lot of fake news and also schemes to steal personal data from refugees and a lot of uncertainty, especially because in Brazil we had a situation where the president, as you may know, Jair Bolsonaro, and the governors and the mayors, they were giving mixed signs. So for example, in the case of São Paulo, the governor was much more serious in adopting lockdown or social distance measures than the president. So a lot of people, not just refugees, but even Brazilians, they were not sure who they should follow, the president, the federal government, or the governor. It was interesting because some refugees, especially from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, and Venezuela, they already experienced lockdown situations and crisis situations in their home countries. So for them, passing through lockdown or these crisis situations in Brazil was not new, and they knew more or less what to do. They also had their own perceptions about the Brazilian political leadership, so they saw this tension between responses in the federal level and in the state level. There were a lot of mental health issues, so the refugees, they mentioned they felt, they were feeling anxious, they fear for their lives and their families, they were stressed, they were concerned about the family that was left behind in the countries of origin, and they feel sometimes guilty, especially because there was a very, a case that was very on the media about the situation of a refugee from Syria who brought his mom, and his mom got COVID and she died. So this refugee, he was really frustrated and guilty about this situation. At the same time, the refugees, they have hope for the future and about the lessons that this crisis can learn about how we deal with nature, how we should adapt ourselves, how we should be resilient and have faith in God, in that the future will be better. So why refugees in Brazil are more affected than the nationals? In average, the refugees, they lack social networks. So there were many cases where the refugees said, I just have me and my wife and my child. So if my wife gets sick, I will have to stop working, so I have to take care of her. I have no one else that can help me. And most of the Brazilians, they have broader social networks, families or friends who could jump in those cases of somebody getting sick. And the refugees, they lack those social networks that would be especially important for support in context of crises like COVID-19. The refugees, they also fear discrimination and xenophobia. So there are some studies that show that migrants and refugees, they face discrimination and racism, especially if they are Black migrants and refugees, when assessing the Brazilian universal healthcare system that we call SUS. And some refugees themselves, they feared getting sick because they would say, oh, if I get sick and I have to go to the hospital and the hospital is full and the doctor has to decide which one they are going to choose to survive, they're going to choose a Brazilian and not me. And this fear of discrimination and xenophobia is not an issue for Brazilians at all. There are a lot of difficulties to access information and benefits. So most of the official information on COVID is in Portuguese, and especially the information to access the benefits. So the Brazilian federal government created a benefit of 600 Brazilian reais a month for people in need of this support. So unemployed people, informal workers, or people that were already in a situation of poverty, they could apply for this benefit through an app. But there was a lot of uncertainty on how refugees and migrants could access this app. This app was only in Portuguese. The type of information this app asked, so for example, the type of document was the document from Brazilians. So refugees were not sure with their document they could put their document numbers in the system and the system would actually work. So there are these language and bureaucratic and cultural barriers that prevent refugees from accessing those services, and those barriers, they are not felt by a Brazilian, for example. The migration services were closed. So in Brazil, we have the federal police, who is our border authority, and we have the National Committee for Refugees, who is responsible for deciding, for doing the asylum process, also analyzing cases of traveling or other cases, and all those services, they were suspended. So refugees, they had appointments with the federal police to decide about their naturalization procedures, or they were waiting the decision of their family reunification procedures. And the Brazilian border was closed and continued to be closed to migrants and all foreigners. So refugees, they are not sure if their family members who already got family reunification visas will be able to enter in Brazil, or if their family members who were in the middle of the family reunification procedures could get the family reunification visa. And this is a problem mainly to refugees. For Brazilians, most Brazilians, they are not worried if the border is closed, and because their families are mostly in Brazil, and they don't have to apply for family reunification visas. Some essential services for refugees, they were closed. So there are some research that show that almost 80% of all refugees in Brazil, they send money abroad to some family left behind. And the organizations, the services like Western Union who send money abroad, they were closed. And also international telephone services, they were also closed. So although refugees, they have access to cell phones and internet in Brazil, their family members left behind, they don't have always this access to internet. So the only way to communicate with this family is through international telephone. So some refugees I interviewed, they lacked information about their families because they did not know, they could not go to call them using international telephone systems. There were a lot of concerns about the situation of their families, especially because the country of origins, they were at war, so Syria, or they lacked resources to fight COVID-19. So refugees from Mali, refugees from Congo, they were really worried that their families would not survive. One, because they could not send money back home, and second, because the country was just poor and facing a series of problems and was not, they had no resources to actually fight COVID-19. And also the organizations that provide services, the civil society organizations providing services to refugees, they were physically closed. So although these organizations, they were trying to provide these services online through Skype, through Facebook, through WhatsApp, through email, the refugees, they lacked this point of reference as a place they could go. And they would reflect on the different experiences of Europe and Brazil. So how Europe was responding to COVID-19 in a more effective way than Brazil, and how refugees were receiving support to pass this crisis, while Brazil was not doing their part. At the same time, refugees, they were sharing food with people that were vulnerable. There were a lot of refugees that were distributing food to homeless. They were shopping for people at risk in a way to give back to Brazilians. And they have this collective conscience that they should stay at home for everybody, that the government should help everybody, not just refugees, because everybody is affected. And there were a lot of self-organized actions to help people. So refugees organizing how they could help other people. And they were worried about vulnerable people like homeless and poor and vulnerable Brazilians, people living in occupations and shelters, and newly arrived migrants and foreigners in Brazil in general. Occupations are like old buildings that they were abandoned, and some people, they go and live in those spaces. But those spaces, they are not prepared for people to live there. So they like water, they like running water, they like energy, and they are places that are really in a situation of precarity. But many refugees in São Paulo, they live in those occupations, and they are facing a really hard situation. They cannot adopt measures of hygiene and social distance. And at the same time, the refugees had some lessons. So hope, they had some recipes on how to reinvent themselves during crisis and continue. They knew how to live under pressure. They had already faced some traumatic situations that taught them how to continue and how to be resilient and to adapt in situations of crisis. And they also expected that all this pandemic would change the way that human beings relate to nature and others, and that life matters. So life matters more than the economics, and the health is the most important thing. Then we think about economics, for example. How and what are the implications for practitioners' work? So the first thing is how the refugees and our clients, they are accessing information. How are we dealing with the risk of fake news and schemes to steal data? Are the refugees and the clients aware of the aid options, their rights, their access to the benefits, possibility of credit, or any other benefit that was created in the context of COVID-19? They are assessing this information in a way that is useful and effective for them. Do refugees and clients, they have access to healthcare and mental health services without discrimination or racism or xenophobia? This is super important, especially the mental health part, because those people, they already have some traumatic situation they pass, and right now they are going through this again, so this trauma can be lived again. So mental health services that culturally adapt, are even more necessary. Another question that we should ask is, especially in countries where refugees or asylum seekers, if they access social assistance, this may impact their naturalization or family reunification. If the refugees, they are so afraid of accessing social assistance in the context of COVID-19 that they prefer suffering and not asking for help because they are too afraid on how this may impact their naturalization or family reunification perspectives. So how they are accessing this or not because of these concerns on their migration process. How are the clients communicating with their families? Are they being able to communicate in the context of COVID-19? Are they able to send money abroad? This is super important. There are some predictions from the international IOM, International Organization for Migration, that says that that's going to be a decrease of 20% in the remittances. And many countries and families, they survive with this money that comes from abroad. And in general, how are we provide refugees with good information, useful in a manner that they can understand? And most importantly, how are we supporting local and refugee-led organizations, especially in the context of COVID-19, where many of the big organizations, international organizations, are not providing the services they were providing before? And what we can do about it. So in general, just think about how minorities are affected by COVID-19 in different countries and just put ourselves in their shoes. Because sometimes situations that for us as nationals of our countries, we don't think, those people, they are left behind in the COVID-19 responses. Second, we have to pressure our governments in different levels, the local level, the state level, the federal level, to include refugees and migrants' needs in the procedures and answers and remedies against COVID-19, to make sure that they are not left behind. Third, we should try to provide information to migrants and refugees in different languages and formats in our network in a way that is accessible to them and useful to them. Fourth, we could share good practices on how to provide remote services or online services for people in need of international protection. We could support self-organized activities and projects of migrants and refugees communities, and in general, support refugee-led organizations and local organizations that they have more connection with the communities, with the local communities, so they sometimes they have more information on how to access their needs, how to provide services in a way that are useful to them. And I think this last one is important for now and for the future. We should fight for the politicians and the governments not to use the pandemic or the fear of other pandemics to justify deportations, violations of rights, and restrictive asylum measures and border closure. This is super important. So I think that in general, how different contexts are affected by COVID-19 and other pandemics. And this what I wanted to share with you today, and any questions or comments will be really welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was such a great presentation. I think it really touched on so many of the issues that a lot of us were wondering when we saw this theme for this week, in both an overall big picture, but also specifically in the context of Brazil, and how in Brazil there's a lot of refugee inflows from so many different countries. So this was really, really insightful. So thank you. To all the participants on the call, if you guys have questions, yes, fantastic presentation, true. If you guys have any questions, be sure to either put them in the chat or the Q&A. I don't think there are any open questions yet, but we have a few prepared. You guys can think and sort of get brainstorming if you want, but I just had a couple of questions that I had thought about in terms of the theme and then sort of wrote up after hearing your presentation. So my first one is, how do the policies or mechanisms implemented by host countries in response to refugee inflows tend to differ if the country is developed or developing? Because in the beginning you talked about that on the host countries there were only, I think, 2 that were developed countries, and obviously the capabilities or allocations of funds are different in developed or developing countries. But yeah, if you could just speak a little bit more on that, that would be great.
Sure. I think in general, there were a lot of discussion about how refugees, they were a left behind population in COVID-19 responses. I think that the difference between developed countries and developing countries is that in general, developed countries, they have more resources to fight the pandemic. So for example, in the case of Germany, they created a benefit to support people in need, and this benefit was extended to refugees that were already receiving some type of benefits from the government. So this was a good thing. The other interesting things that we saw in European countries were movements for the regularization of undocumented migrants. And this happened in Portugal, and the Portuguese government decided to do this regularization movement as a way to protect the entire country. So saying, hey, if we are leaving behind undocumented migrants, they don't have access to healthcare, and then we are not doing a good job to address the pandemic as a whole, as a country. And then some of those initiatives, they started also in Italy, also focused in the economic structures of the country. The main problem with developing countries is that they are on average poor countries. So, for example, Brazil is a very unequal country. So you have many Brazilians that are in a very difficult situation, vulnerable situation, who were in the informal labor market, and right now they cannot work because of the pandemic. So they lost any source of income. So any type of programs you provide to the Brazilian population or the Indian population, you have millions and millions of people. So Brazil has a 200 million people, 200 million Brazilians. And then the resources, they are not enough. But in general, refugees are left behind population. So there was a movement of organizations in Europe asking for the relocation of vulnerable refugees who were in Greece, who were in refugee camps in Greece. And some countries, they accepted to receive those, especially children. So Germany has received, Luxembourg, Portugal has also accepted, but many countries, they could have done more, especially in the relocation scheme, than they did. So in general, refugees are left behind population.
Very true. And also when you're explaining the different countries, it's interesting to kind of think about, for example, the United States, how that response sort of fits in, not as much with the developed countries in the way that their programs or policies are written up and implemented, but very interesting, unique scenarios with the US and Brazil and those responses. We have a couple of questions from audience members. First, Paula says, thanks for your presentation. How are international, I think, organizations supporting refugees in Brazil? Is there a regional strategy? And then you kind of already touched on how developing countries support refugees, but.
Yes, so in Brazil, you have UNHCR and you have IOM, and Brazil is part of the regional strategy to support Venezuelans. And then you have many UN organizations involved, so IOM, UNHCR, also civil society organizations that in Brazil and international organizations. And they continue to have to act during the pandemic, especially in the north of Brazil, in the state of Roraima, where there is the state where you have the border with Venezuela, where the problem right now with Brazil is that the border is closed. So new Venezuelans, they cannot enter to apply for asylum. And the border closing decrees, they are especially discriminatory against Venezuelans. So for example, they say that there are exceptions to the border closure for humanitarian reasons, but at the same time, it excludes Venezuelans for those humanitarian reasons. So you have this border that are, the borders, they continue to close. So new Venezuelans cannot arrive in Brazil, but you have these international organizations that are acting in Brazil. Not just in Brazil, you have a regional initiative to deal with Venezuelans, with the Venezuelan crisis in Latin American countries. So Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and other countries. How can developing countries support refugees? I think I'm going to just say about Brazil. So Brazil has a very progressive law towards refugees, and so it guarantees rights for refugees without discrimination. Actually, non-discrimination is also a principle of the Brazilian Constitution, but we have many implementation issues, and those implementation issues, they happen, in my opinion, one, because refugees are not a topic. So if you take the entire migrant population in Brazil, from Apple CEOs in Brazil until undocumented migrants and all refugees, asylum seekers in Brazil, that would be less than 1% of the Brazilian population. And then, so they are invisible, they cannot vote, and Brazil has many developing challenges, so it's hard. But I think that if Brazil wanted to implement its law, would be a really good thing. And
okay, yeah,
that could
very interesting.
Yeah.
That in the Brazil scenario, where some countries struggle to even write up kind of comprehensive policy, Brazil has the policy, has the ideas, but then the implementation is the challenge, for sure. So the next question that we have is, and you kind of touched on it in terms of like the region and sharing the border, but why are Venezuelans recognized as refugees specifically in Brazil as opposed to other countries? / does Brazil have a broader definition that allows them to view Venezuelans as refugees?
Yes, so in Latin America has the Cartagena Declaration from 1984, and the Cartagena Declaration has expanded the definition of asylum in Latin America to involve also situations of serious and generalized violation of human rights. And Brazil was the first country in Latin America to internalize this definition in its asylum law. Many Latin American countries, they did it after Brazil. They also internalized it, focusing, for example, some countries, they went even beyond Brazil, also recognizing generalized violations of human rights, but also, for example, gender persecution, or in some countries even natural disasters. But Brazil recognized this situation of grave and generalized violation of human rights. So for a long time, there was a discussion if Venezuelans, a political discussion inside Brazil, if Venezuela should or should not be recognized as refugees. And when Bolsonaro was elected, this was even more serious because Bolsonaro is very against migration. So during the campaign, he said that the migrants, they were the worst thing in the world, they were the trash of the world. So there was a lot of questions. Will Brazil recognize Venezuela? But then in the middle of 2019, the National Committee of Refugees recognized that Venezuela is a situation of serious and generalized violation of human rights. So all Venezuelans that applied for asylum and that they are not excluded from the refugee status, for example, if they committed a crime against humanity, they cannot be recognized as refugees, of course. They will be recognized as refugees. So now the 39,000 Venezuelans, they were recognized as refugees. But this clause of this serious and generalized violation of human rights is very political. So for example, between 2010, 2016, we had 80,000 of Haitians who arrived in Brazil. And a lot of people, they were making the claim that there was a situation of serious and generalized violation of Haiti, especially after the 2010 earthquake. But Brazil did not recognize Haitians as under this clause of severe and generalized violation of human rights. Syrians, they are recognized as refugees also based in the serious and generalized violation of human rights that we see in Syria right now. But for example, Congolese are not perceived inside this clause of severe and generalized violation of human rights. So this is a very political discussion on how we use this violation of human rights.
And it seems to kind of have a huge discrepancy depending on the country and like when this was brought up. So those are all challenges that, especially in the context of Brazil, have to be dealt with. Next question is, measures to help refugees are appreciated, but my worry is, why are we not putting in measures to curb some of the reasons that lead to forced displacement and migration? I don't know, maybe this is a general question, but also if you want to speak to the context of Latin America.
Yes, so if we think about the causes of forced displacement in the world, the the next years they are not really optimistic. So we are going with climate change. We are going to have more natural disasters and situations where people will be forced displaced due to climate connected issues. So if we see in this context of COVID-19, there was an initiative from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and also from UN to stop the conflicts. But unfortunately, this was not possible, and many conflicts they continue today, and they continue to displace people. In Brazil specifically, right now, we have a very hard political situation with this government, as I don't know, you may or may not know. So Brazil has one of the worst COVID presidents who are not adopting any measures to protect the Brazilian population. Actually, we don't have a official health minister, and in the past 3 months, he just fired 3 health ministers in the middle of the crisis because they were doing more or less their job. And also the president is really against the situation in Venezuela. So he used a lot Venezuela as an example during the campaign, the electoral campaign, to say, hey, Brazilians, you should vote for me, because if you vote to the other party, we will be Venezuela. So Venezuela has this political use, but the president is actually not doing anything to solve the crisis. He's just, in my opinion, putting more fire in the crisis. And also we have a very latent political crisis in Brazil. And the Brazilian foreign policy, the Brazilian foreign affairs for many years was considered one of the best in the world, a very traditional one. Brazil was a very diplomatic country who could negotiate, who was supportive of human rights at the UN fora. And if you take since this year, since Bolsonaro, this changed completely. So Brazil is voting against gender issues in UN, against indigenous rights in UN and other fora. Brazil was saying bad things about the World Health Organization and how the World Health Organization is communist and against the government. So it's a very difficult moment to access, in my opinion, the possibility of Brazil being a mediator. So for example, under Lula, Brazil tried to mediate the tension between the US and Iran and the UN in Iran. They even activated an agreement. But under Bolsonaro, I don't see this very progressive work of Brazil towards peace negotiations. I'm sorry for that.
So a lot of the issues then for even long-term prevention of forced displacement and migration in the context of Latin America and Brazil's role, a lot has to do with the administration that's in power and sort of their role in navigating or taking back any progress that was made in this current situation. The next question is on the same kind of scape of Brazil. Does Brazil also ask for a passport to achieve the refugee status in Peru that is happening and that is causing problems for many Venezuelans that are in need for protection?
Yes, in theory, according to the asylum law, no, the refugee, they can apply for refugee status in Brazil without documents. They don't need. But sometimes in the implementation, especially when they are going to access some services, they ask for the passport. But then we have, for example, the public defender, and they send like an official letter explaining, hey, according to the law of the asylum law, Article 43, we cannot ask for those documents from the origin country. So this is not being a cause of protections. Some Venezuelans that are in Brazil, they do not apply for asylum, because also in Brazil they have other regularization possibilities. But the ones that decide, they can apply without having a passport or not.
So it just kind of depends on the person and the context. So I think the last question we have right now, at least, is, are there specific implementations for children refugees and their families during this crisis with COVID in Brazil and also developed countries such as Germany?
Yeah, one of those things that they tried to do about refugee children was that the relocation from Greece, that was a very important thing on how to protect those children, especially in refugee camps. But in many countries, the refugees, families, and children, including the US, they continued to stay in detention centers. Although civil society organizations were asking for their release, also applying to courts for their release. That's not the case of Brazil. We don't have detention centers. Brazil has adopted in 2017 a decree, a determination from CONARI and other organizations, including the public defenders, to guarantee the rights of unaccompanied children and separated children, putting the public defenders as the official representatives of those children in any procedures, migration procedures, or documental procedures in Brazil. So this was a really important thing. And the public defenders, although they were closed for physical one-on-one appointments, they were providing information for refugees and migrants, and also providing services online and with very reduced numbers of appointments. So they continue to help these families. The other really important things that the public defenders they did, they entered, they applied in, they entered against the Brazilian government in the Brazilian juridical system to guarantee the access for refugees and migrants for the benefit, the monetary benefit for people who need it. To guarantee the access in the app, but also once that the money was approved, the bank was not giving the money because they said that some of those refugees, they did not have the right document. So the public defenders, they entered, they initiated a lawsuit against the government and the bank saying, hey, you should grant this money without asking, without making discrimination of the documents. And then they won it. This was something really important for the refugees families in the context of COVID-19 in Brazil.
I think on the same realm, the question, what is Brazil's policy concerning unaccompanied children? So maybe more sort of what the actual law says the children have rights to if they're unaccompanied children, sort of on the same realm that you were talking about before.
Yes, so Brazil has accepted the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we have internalized what we call the status of children and adolescents in Brazil. So in theory, all refugees or migrant children, they have the same rights than any Brazilian kids, children inside this ECA law. So once a refugee, as a child arrives in Brazil, migrant, refugee, asylum seeker, doesn't matter her status or their family status, she has access to education, public education, and the public healthcare without discrimination. Sometimes there are some implementation issues, some universities, some schools who ask for documents that the family or the refugee, they don't have it, but the public defenders and the civil society organizations, they explain the law to the school, and the school they do something about it, especially because you have some neighborhoods in Brazil where you have more migrants and refugees, especially in São Paulo. So you have some the principals more concerned about the access of this population and how to do cultural exchange activities and integration activities to support this population. Especially on unaccompanied children, Brazil does not receive a lot of unaccompanied children like US or Europe, but the number is growing up. So until 2017, there was no clear procedure for how these unaccompanied children could apply for asylum. So at the time, I was volunteering in a civil society organization in São Paulo, and I remember that when one boy arrived, that was a chaos because there was no procedure. So these civil society organizations and other organizations in São Paulo, they entered in contact with one judge in the childhood area of civil law in Brazil, and they make like a training with this judge. So all cases of unaccompanied children, they would send to this judge So this judge would put the child in a foster care in the foster system of Brazil. But then the problem is that this child would be undocumented until the principal, the director of the foster care home or the foster care parent could go with the child to the federal police to apply for asylum. After 2017, this changed because right now, every time unaccompanied children or separate children, when they arrive at the border communicates the public defenders, and the public defenders, they are all around Brazil, and they are trained to do the best interest assessment and determination of this child, and they represent this child, so they can apply for asylum for this child immediately, and then they can also decide and do all the legal juridical procedures to guarantee the protection of this child. So assessing, for example, family reunification possibilities in Brazil, or determining the best interest of the child to be in this foster care or this foster association. Some of the problems that they continue to have in the integration of unaccompanied children is that there are no shelters for unaccompanied children. So sometimes those children, they end up in shelters with children who had a problem with the law in Brazil. So some of those unaccompanied children, they said they face prejudice because the neighborhood would see them as children against the law, as children who had problems with the law, and they were not that type of things. But right now, with the new decree, the public defenders is much better in solving these issues.
Well, so definitely a complicated thing, lots of different factors, but sounds like the strength and kind of heavy presence of public defenders and civil society in Brazil are kind of what's facilitating this whole thing and the implementation of being successful. So that's really interesting. And I think something that, I don't know, I don't think in the States, like, I think that's a huge difference between the two countries. Okay, next question. I think this might be the last question we have time for because we're kind of coming to the hour right now, but in the post-COVID world, do you think groups like UNHCR/IOM will be weakened with the increased politicization of refugees? Would local organizations be able to fill the lost services?
Well, I think the Brazilian context is very specific. So in Brazil, the civil society organizations, they have a really important role in the asylum policy. So for example, this happened because, so Brazil had almost 30 years, more than 30 years actually, almost 30 years of military dictatorship. So during this period, Brazil did not recognize anyone as refugees, and you had a lot of people coming from other dictatorships like in Argentina and Chile and arriving in Brazil. And the civil society organizations, especially organizations connected to the Catholic Church, they were providing help to these people that needed protection. So Brazilians that need to go to Europe or United States because they were facing persecution in Brazil, and other Chileans and Argentinians coming to Brazil and then willing to go to Europe to be saved. So when Brazil, when UNHCR came to Brazil, when we had the redemocratization, those civil societies, they made a lot of effort to have the approval of the asylum law. And they were experts in asylum and protection needs. So they had a lot to teach to the Brazilian state. So civil society organizations are part of the National Committee of Refugees, and they decide also with the other representatives from the government, the asylum procedures in Brazil and the asylum policies. So this is a good thing. The bad thing is that many of these organizations are mainly funded by UNHCR. So they cannot provide a lot of critique to UNHCR work, for example. Another problem that we already have about the politicization of refugees is that we already see in Brazil specifically like a fight between IOM and UNHCR to decide who will be responsible for Venezuelans, especially the indigenous. So we see this competition, and for me as a Brazilian studying this topic, it was really interesting to see the new global trends, the categories of Venezuelans displaced abroad in UNHCR report, the global trends. So they created a new category to say, hey, we are also responsible for Venezuelans. And this is also connected with donors funding and other interests. And what we don't see a lot is that mainly of UNHCR and IOM, they don't support local organizations many times the way they should, especially refugee-led organizations that they are doing a very important work right now. Because they say they are not trustable, they don't have a lot of training, they don't know the bureaucratic vocabulary of the donors, but I don't see a movement to train those organizations better and to support those organizations better. We see in Brazil this collaboration between the civil society organizations, the traditional civil society organizations, but I think this is still lacks in many other contexts.
Yeah, this is definitely a criticism that, at least in humanitarian work and in development, a lot of people more recently have kind of taken a step back and said, hey, UNHCR and I guess IOM as well, like, you guys aren't supposed to be just this. I mean, they understand big bureaucracy, of course, because that is what they are, but to sort of not just overshadow refugee-led organizations, and that almost has the reverse effect on what they're trying to accomplish. So super interesting. Thank you so much, Patricia. We're just coming to the end of the hour now. I think we got a lot of our questions answered, and definitely such an insightful presentation. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you again for the invitation. It was my pleasure.
Great. Thanks so much. And don't forget, guys, this will be recorded. So we'll share the link later on. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.